Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and to this week's competitive event top placing Votann list analysis episode. Before we begin, I just want to thank everyone that tuned in for last week's episode and to the currently six new subscribers that joined the channel. So thank you. Your support really means a lot to me. With that said, let's jump into the video. On today's agenda, we'll be reviewing the Fight Before Xmas 23 event held in New Zealand for the weekend of December 9th and 10th, 2023. We'll start things off with a quick placing summary, deep dive into the list, examine some of the strengths and weaknesses, and finish off by contextualizing each matchup from the event. So this Votann list piloted by Sean Sullivan came first out of 38 players, ending the event with a 5 wins, 0 loss placing. Matchups included a 92-57 win for Votann versus World Eaters, a 100-30 win against Chaos Demons, a closer game of 68-58 versus Chaos Space Marines, an 87-59 victory against Grey Knights, and a final narrow win of 91-87 against Orcs. Let's take a look at the list and contextualize some of those matchups. Alright, so kicking things off, we have a Cal with Grim Demeanor leading a unit of 10 Plasma Gun and Regular Fist Hearthguard, followed by an Einir Champion leading a 10-man brick of Hearthguard, each equipped with Vulcanites and Plasma Blades. So these are obviously making for two very powerful hammer units that sit in Deep Strike, waiting to descend on their targets. Right off the bat, I want to call out how interesting of a loadout mix we have here. Now, to this day, people are still posting questions about the strongest Hearthguard loadouts, and while it might not be obvious at first, many would be surprised to see that you can't really go wrong with either selection that you make. There's this really good article that maths out the differences, and what we ultimately see here is that it's not really about what you choose to equip your Hearthguard with, but rather who you choose to lead them, depending on the loadouts they have. In this case, it's quite obvious that the lethal hits provided by the Cal offer some really excellent benefits when placed with the Plasma Gun squad, where you can expect to generate, on average, 1 to 2 lethal hits out of their 10 shots, which is absolutely punishing to enemy units that don't have an invulnerable save. Conversely, the lethal hits would be sort of wasted here on the Vulcanite squad, as you effectively reduce the amount of devastating wounds you have available in your dice pool, which is obviously what you're relying on when you run Vulcanites because they have no AP value. So you really just want these to go through without your opponent taking a save, being the devastating wound. The reroll charge from the champion on this squad is also quite nice, with some added mortal wounds that he brings himself, which helps to offset the potential lethal hits you miss out on by not choosing the Cal. So nothing too crazy looking at the ranged weapon loadouts, but what I'm really interested in examining are the melee weapon selections for the units. Generally, we see the regular fists being selected over plasma gauntlets because it allows for you to have greater play into anything T6 and beyond, or generally just more play into more things, which is always good, right? I'm not really sure how I feel about including a 10-man brick with plasma blades in this list because I feel like you're really compromising the damage output of your hammer in order to accommodate some other list selections, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's obvious that the fists scale better into higher toughness targets, and considering you're investing over 300 points into the unit because you have a character attached, I would think it would be most effective to prioritize really high value targets with this unit rather than going for infantry that would be less than T6 in order to be able to optimize your wound rolls from plasma gauntlets instead. Especially given that most Votann lists don't really lack any anti-infantry shooting, which means the plasma blades might be wasted here. That said, there are a couple of matchups where I could see plasma blades being really valuable, and obviously into lists where the threats are infantry, such as with orcs. So we'll keep this in mind as we keep going through the list to see if we can make more sense of this decision. Next up, we have a standard 10-man Hearthkin Warrior squad. You know him, you love him for stickies. I'm really happy to see these in the list. I find at least one squad should be mandatory from what I've researched and seen. Being able to sticky an objective is absolutely invaluable, and while they do obviously die to a breeze and they lack any meaningful shooting, the ability to split them up into 2 Sagittars and very quickly and early in the game get onto some contestable objective is pivotal to gaining board presence and establishing an early lead. And the other 2 Sagittars, all of which are running the high last cannon by the way, are 2 Chthonian Berserker squads, both are wielding concussion balls. So I actually quite like the Berserks. I'm really happy that they're finally getting some recognition towards the end of the year here, whereas before they were often really overlooked, and some people still think that they're terrible. For 100 points, you get a unit that, if it's used properly, basically always trades up. and by quite a large margin at that. So it allows you to quickly either swing objectives, deter charges, or even just heavily weaken a scary unit before your Hearthguard come down to clean it up, and then they get to dominate the board unchallenged. I think now's a good opportunity for us to revisit the Hearthguard loadouts that we mentioned a little bit earlier. I think that the pilot of this list is designating the role of these Berserks to be dedicated anti-elite or vehicle melee units, and obviously like that's super fine and obviously a very valid use of the unit. Maybe if anti-infantry melee is a concern, which it might be since he decided to run the plasma blades, having one of these Berserk squads instead take plasma axes could help address the anti-infantry blob threat while also allowing your Hearthguard unit, who are the real stars of your list, to take their optimized loadout of fists and really just shine. I would personally much rather have the anti-infantry on my cheaper units that have the ability to punch up, and keep my expensive brick as the hammer that's needed to address any other meaningful concerns in my opponent's list. We also have one unit of Pioneers here, which I think are always just excellent units to bring in a list for their scoring potential. They're very quick, they teleport around the board, they could be a pain to deal with late in the game if you make it there. Now, I will say that I'm a little torn on the use of Pioneers. I think that in some lists, they're much better as an early game anti-screen unit. So you really just bring them up early, you throw them away so they die, but what you're trying to do is just dominate early by killing anything that could threaten the movement of your vehicles, especially your Hecaton, right? That might be transporting Hearthguard. Obviously, that's not applicable to this list, so I can see why he opted for the other use of Pioneers, which would be just purely to score. And he just included one, so it's like a token unit that's designated role is just to go out on the board quickly, easily with the teleportation shenanigans and just do the secondary objectives that need to be done. Especially late in the game, if you could hold this unit back, it could go around pretty uncontested. I quickly covered the Sagittar loadouts earlier, but just to conclude on those, the Hylas cannon is super effective when you have several in the list because you're simply adding increased probability of achieving a higher damage shot per dice roll that you roll throughout the game. We saw a list last week that ran a more stable but lower output loadout for missiles, which we concluded was the right choice in that setup. I'm happy to see the Hylas here because we have an additional Sagittar taking a number to 4, and this really helps curve that variance. And within the larger context of the list itself, we see that there really isn't any other source of vehicle anti-tank shooting that exists. The other vehicle here, being the Hecaton Land Fortress, is running a conversion beamer, which is probably one of my preferred choices for loadouts here. So what we get is a really big, tough vehicle. It's difficult to shift. It has some pretty reliable anti-infantry or elite killing power, obviously complementary to both the Hearthguard squads and the Sagittar loadouts that we discussed earlier. They also forego the missile for a spectral scanner, which I do think is a smart choice here because we're expecting to get multiple shots in with this vehicle, and we would much rather ensure that we negate any cover saves that are taken to optimize the value of each successful wound that goes through, rather than making a one-shot missile that will be outperformed by the 4 Sagittars throughout the course of the game. So something to note about the Hecaton that I find quite important and is often overlooked is its transport capacity and the ability to have the disembarked unit re-roll all the wound rolls it makes after the land fort has shot. I feel like this rule is often overlooked when people consider list design, and they just kind of see the fort as this tough model that parks on an objective, which no doubt it is, but in taking the unit for that purpose, you're paying the extra points for a feature that you're otherwise not using, being, of course, the disembarkation reroll wound ability. I can't say for certain if the pilot of this list utilized the 3 Thunderkin as the unit riding into Hecaton, or if he included them for the reserves threat, probably both. But assuming that the land fort was included to maximize the value that it brings to the game, we can assume that they rode in the vehicle, at least in some times, to benefit from the rule, in addition to, of course, being able to get somewhere really quickly and safely. So these 3 Thunderkin are running bolt cannons, which I'm starting to see become more of a trend. We also see the inclusion of a separate unit of 6 Thunderkin that are equipped with Graviton cannons coming out of reserves, which is the more typical loadout you expect to see. I quite like the differentiation here, and I think the pilot did a great job of understanding the shooting capability of each unit when constructing his list. By that, I mean that I think it's generally a bad idea to take a squad of 3 Thunderkin with Gravitons, and if you want to include Gravitons, you should only do so in squads of 6. I think I might make a more dedicated video on this just to talk about it a little bit more, maybe like a Tactica video. But we could run through some really quick, dirty math just to illustrate what I mean. Just please note everything's rounded up or down as appropriate where it has to be. So I didn't really leave the decimals in. I'll probably do that better when we're actually covering this in a separate video. If we look at 6 Thunderkin here with Gravitons, we can see that on average they generate, well, from their 66 shots, a total of 21 shots. So out of these 21 shots, they'll be hitting on 3s with a token to equate to around 14 successful hits. Out of these 14 hits, they're wounding on 2s for vehicles, which are the intended targets, and we can estimate around 12 wounds succeeding. Out of these 12 wounds, they're minus 2 AP against a 3+ save, taking it to the 5, means around 8 of these will fail. 8 wounds at 2 damage a pop means we're looking at around 16 damage total to a vehicle, which means you should reliably be able to pop a vehicle threat every turn, so long as they don't use Armor of Contempt to reduce your AP, have cover, or have anything better than a 5++. Take this math now and divide it by 2 to see how much a squad of 3 will do on average. On average is important here because sure, you might spike and get super lucky getting 6 shots each, but on average you can account for 3, which means, well, 3.5, which means a squad of 3 coming out of reserves will only get half the damage in that's on the screen here, taking us down to around 8 or even less with Armor of Contempt or cover, which is obviously no longer a reasonable damage threat to some kind of vehicle that you're intending to kill. That said, I do think that if you do run these guys, and there isn't anything necessarily wrong with doing that, as they're still very point efficient units, you should absolutely run Gravitons in squads of 6 because it takes on average all 6 in order to effectively kill their intended targets in the game. Now, I want to touch on the 3-man bolt cannons quickly because I think this is also quite interesting. 3 Thunderkin with bolt cannons produce 3 shots each at sustain 1. This means, on average, you can expect 9 shots total with around 2 from sustained. This takes us to 11 shots that hit on 3s because there's a token, and resulting in a total of 7 successful hits. These 7 hits wound on 2s, so we're assuming, infantry and tokens, and this equates to around 6 wounds that get through. 6 wounds at minus 1 AP against a 3+ save, it takes the opponent to a 4+ save, meaning around 3 will fail. 3 wounds at 2 damage, you're looking to do about 6 damage spread over 3 shots into your target. Now, let's change it up a bit and assume that the pilot is taking this land fort to optimize the value it generates, and he wants to throw the Thunderkin inside of it to get those reroll wounds. So, same math again here. We get the 3 shots with sustain 1, so we get around 11 shots hitting on 3s, which generates 7 hits. You got the 7 hits wounding on 2s, but now we have the infantry, so it's wounding on 2s because they're lower armor with the token, and then you got the rerolls. So instead of 6 wounds, we get 7 wounds that go through. These 7 wounds at minus 1 AP against a 3+ save equals to around 4 fails. So 4 wounds at 2 damage is an average of 8 damage instead of 6. So I guess the question I'm asking myself here when I look at this is this like actually good? Is it good enough? Does this 75-point unit do something of value with its shooting here? There's only really one other comparable unit in the roster of Votann that I could think of that would be able to benefit from a Hecaton Land Fortress with this intent, and that's running 5 Hearthguard. So if we want, we could quickly map that out and see what we get. 5 Hearthguard with Vulcanites and a grenade launchers come out of a Hecaton Land Fortress. They get 3 shots each with Dev 1. That's 15 shots total. 15 shots hitting on 2s because there's a token, or just not because they hit on 2s anyway. That's 12 hits. 12 hits wounding on 3s, elite infantry plus a token plus the reroll is equal to 11 wounds, 2 of which are devastating wounds. So you get 9 that go through and 2 that are automatically in. AP 0 against a 3+ save equals 3 fails. So you get 3 wounds at 1 damage plus 2 devs. On average, a squad of 5 coming out of a Hecaton rerolling will deal 5 damage to a target. For the grenade launchers, we're looking at 5d6 shots each plus blast, meaning we're getting around 23 shots total here. Out of these 23 shots, they're hitting on 2s, which means 19 succeed. Out of the 19 successful hits, they're wounding on force for elite infantry with tokens, and if they're re-rolling, this means we can anticipate around 14 wounds of our rolls going through. Out of these 14 wound rolls, they're at 0 AP against a 3+ save, meaning around 5 of them should fail. 5 wounds at 1 damage apiece means you can anticipate doing 5 damage total on average with these grenade launchers, taking the total damage up to 10. Obviously, like looking at this, I was kind of expecting to see more wounds here from the Hearthguard, to be honest with you, but we are looking at shooting alone. So we haven't even considered that this unit has very powerful melee output, which would surely be significant when we consider the anti-infantry nature of both the fist loadout and the plasma gauntlet as well. What does this all mean? Obviously, this looks like an unfair comparison because you're telling me, okay, the Thunderkin are literally half the points cost of the Hearthguard unit, so obviously they bring less damage to the table at the benefit of bringing additional units. Furthermore to that, in fact, the damage is so close that you could argue that the Thunderkin are bringing you even better value if you don't want to have that melee threat. That's true, but what this math does kind of imply is that putting a squad of 3 in the land fort just might not be the most effective use of the land fort's ability or points, because while you do get to re-roll wounds that come out of it, it only equates to 1 extra wound that goes through or 2 more damage. I think the point I'm trying to get at here is that if you want to take a squad of 3 Thunderkin, you really aren't gaining that much value out of putting them in a land fort, other than being able to safely and quickly get them to a particular spot on the board that you want them to be at, which honestly might be all that you're looking for. And again, that's totally viable. I think that the land fort value here really shines when you have the 5-man Hearthguard unit instead. While double the points of the Thunderkin and doing comparable damage with shooting, they also have the benefit of wanting to be in the middle of the board, which is where you should be bringing your Hecaton, close to combat, as they carry a lot of anti-infantry and elite killing power. The land fort in this case gives added value by enhancing their shooting to fish for the devastating wounds, where the potential for value is much higher than simply re-rolling the bolt cannon shots for an additional wound roll to stick. Lastly, I want to add that with the bolt cannon, the Thunderkin can comfortably shoot from 36 inches away, being their longest ranged option. Ultimately, I'm not sure that I'm completely sold on running a squad of 3, especially not in a land fort, unless I wanted to threaten reserves and kill maybe some chaff. That said, I think that if you don't have the points for 5 Hearthguard and want to bring more bodies to the table, perhaps this might be a choice worth exploring. I do want to add that in the greater context of this list, I think points were really the issue here, and the pilot knows that the most value from Gravitons come from squads of 6, so having a small 3-man unit with bolt cannons who could sit back comfortably at 36 inches away, picking up whatever models remain from any other targets, could be an excellent use of 75 points for T6 bodies. Anyway, it could be that I'm not seeing the bigger picture here, but surely there's something that's working since it did work out for the pilot, and if you guys think differently, I'm curious to hear your opinions. All that said, I think there are some very clear strengths to a list like this. Firstly, as a whole, we see a very take-all-comer design where we have a deliberate answer to every problem thrown at us. We spread our threats out, don't rely on one specific unit, diversify the roster. We have a super flexible playstyle and can afford to be reactive, waiting for opportunities to commit our 2 hammers. And of course, we have very good success with secondary scoring due to the responsive and flexible nature of the list and the units within it. As for weaknesses, there honestly really aren't that many. Most of these are personal preferences and questions that I'm sure all have very valid answers. For instance, why choose the blades over more gauntlets for our Hearthguard when the Berserkers could substitute that role instead? Does the land fort make use of its ability value in a list like this? It seems a little heavy on Thunderkin, but again, that 3-man unit might be here just due to remaining points. I will say one weakness is that the list lacks redundancy. We have bikes, but there's only one. We have a durable land fort, but there's only one. We have Hearthguard, but the loadouts have them optimized for 2 very different roles and targets. I do think that in a take-all-comers list like this, it just works as a result of that. You sacrifice redundancy for secondary play and general responsiveness, which is a very effective win condition, as we can see. Wrapping the video up, I just want to contextualize some of the matchups here. I won't talk too long as I think most of these are self-explanatory, but there are a couple we'll stick on for a while longer. For game 1, a list like this into World Leaders does very well because of our ability to soak the initial charges with our vehicles, and if they make it to us without being shot, pop our vehicles, they're immediately met with a counterpunch from our Berserks, kept within. Like I said earlier, these guys, especially with mauls, can trade very effectively, and against World Leaders, you don't need to worry about getting shot before you make it to combat because world leaders are rushing to you. Game 2 against demons, I would imagine it's quite nice due to putting judgment tokens on the biggest 4 threats, usually the big demons, and utilizing the effectiveness of your stratagems to amplify your killing potential. For instance, improving your armor pen on melee weapons or providing sustained hits to a huge 10-man brick from Deep Strike. You could really get to fish for a lot of those devastating wounds to come through. Overall, I think you dominate quite easily in this matchup, as we saw last week, as we're very good at killing key judgment units. We also see that with the built-in secondary scores, the pilot was able to very easily max out his missions, securing a perfect game of 100. The Chaos Space Marines are typically a harder matchup for us. This was still a very close game for Votann here, but I would like to think that the ability to reactively respond to Chaos Space Marines is a huge advantage here when compared to the more elite list examined last week. By equipping your list to be take-all-comers, you generally get better play into most opponents. Being able, for instance, to utilize secondary scoring units like the Pioneers, or the 3-man Thunderkin getting around the board for actions while your 2 hammers rain down upon the enemy over the midboard just long enough for you to get a small enough lead, which could be the difference between victory and defeat. Your opponent can't really afford to ignore any one thing since everything is important in this list, and they can't commit to only one area of the board because you yourself can be everywhere and anywhere at once. I would also call out the Land Fort here for being a durable distraction Carnifex into Chaos Space Marines with a really solid shooting profile that can't be ignored, but it's also tanky enough to soak some returning fire. Overall, I think the speed of the vehicles help here to bring Votann to the correct places repeatedly, providing additional scoring potential. Generally, having so many different units in the list, each contributing in their own way, can really help slow the enemy down, as they need to carefully consider what each of their units commits to or ignores. You create decisions for your opponent, mind games if you will, which are always great for board pressure. Okay, you want to commit to killing my bike? No problem. My 2 Sagittars will move up 12 inches here on your backfield. Oh, you want to kill the Sagittars instead and ignore the bikes? No problem. The bikes can enter reserves at the top of your turn, enter your deployment zone beginning of mine. A very close game overall, but I'm happy to see Votann take the win with this list. Votann into Grey Knights I'd imagine is quite nice. They're definitely very mobile, but I feel like they're generally underpowered at the moment. It was a slightly closer game than I'd have expected, but perhaps this is due to the list having less killing power in favor of more secondary scoring. Likewise, the shots from the Hylas and Gravitons might be wasted mid-game onwards, as Grey Knights typically run mass Terminators who can teleport out of range or visibility as needed. Alright, so this last game here is the one I'm most interested in because of how close the scores were. I took a look at the Orc list, which came 5th place at the same event, and it's basically running 4 trucks, a bunch of Beast Snaga stuff, and a lot of characters. I'm talking like 6 characters here. Some are pretty wild ones too, like Captain Badrock, who I've never even heard of before. Basically a very similar archetype to the Votann players list in that it's a really solid all-rounder, take-all-comers list, has strong mission play, good hammers, fast, a lot of stuff to get through. I can definitely see why this was the closest game at 91 to 87, as both lists are basically, in my opinion, the factions' equivalency of each other. I surprisingly really like the Bolt Cannon Thunderkin into this matchup. I think they can pretty reliably delete any character, especially if they come out of the Hecaton. They're also really good into the Storm Boys brought on this list, as you can safely kill them from 36 inches away before they connect with your Hearthguard. Speaking of the Hecaton, the Conversion Beamer is very strong in this matchup as well, considering you chew through infantry. Likewise, I honestly think the Plasma Blade Gauntlets were amazing in this matchup, as the sheer quantity of dice on a charge ensures that anything dies, especially at the general toughness level we see in Orc infantry lists. The Squighog boys are quite scary as well, and they're pretty tough at T6 3 wounds, but this is where the cheap Berserks or even the Fist Hearthguard should be aimed at. Overall, 2 really similar list designs here, even down to the 4v4 transports, making this a super interesting game of cat and mouse, leading to what I'd imagine to be a really tense game down to the very last point, which is reflected in their scores. So huge props to both players for such a tight game. Alright guys, so overall, I think this is a really interesting take on a take-all-comers list for Votann. I was surprised to see only 1 bike, but like I said, it makes sense within the overall context of the list design. And we don't want this to be an early game threat, but rather a late game scorer. There were some pretty deliberate choices like this throughout the roster, and the pilot did a great job of utilizing the list to its full capacity by winning the event. I want to give a huge thank you to everyone for watching this week's video. If you like this kind of content, please do leave a like down below and subscribe for more regular Votann coverage. Stay tuned for next week, where we will have our first couple of hobby videos out. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.